Let's now turn to the situation in Sydney this morning. On the brink of lockdown, with borders across the country snapped shut, a grim reality for millions of Australians this morning, shattering the ambition of our premiers and our Prime Minister to keep the country open.
And the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, joins us now from his own quarantine in Canberra. PM, good morning to you. Thanks for your time this morning. Look, the situation in Sydney is developing really fast, as we've seen on our show this morning. Health Minister Brad Hazzard is in isolation. It's a big worry.
Well, it is, and it's obviously very troubling. The pandemic is unrelenting. I mean, been very consistent. The pandemic hasn't gone anywhere. The virus hasn't gone anywhere, and it continues to seek to strike where it can, not just here in Australia, but all around the world. I mean, we had 27 people die in the United Kingdom yesterday from this virus. There were 12,000 new cases there, and I've just come from there. Here in Australia, I mean, we continue to fight this thing, and the way that we've been able to fight it here has been more successful than most countries around the world. But that doesn't mean we still don't have our challenges, and I'm very confident that the New South Wales government, that has shown such strength and determination over the course of this pandemic, and the people of New South Wales, and particularly those in Sydney now, will work together to ensure they get through this latest challenge.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, you have praised the Premier for her handling of the pandemic. So has the world. In fact, we have on the show here. But is her policy of keeping things open potentially going to come back to bite her?
Look, I don't believe so. The Premier and I spoke at some length yesterday, and I've been keeping in contact over the course of this last week with the situation in New South Wales. I think the approach that she's taking is the right one. There are sensible restrictions that are being put in place, and they're affecting people right across Sydney. My family's back in Sydney. I was talking to Jen and girls last night, and they'll be obviously doing what everyone else in Sydney is doing. But everyone knows that to get out of this current situation, we've got to follow those rules, and I have no doubt that the New South Wales government will ease those restrictions the second they can. That's always been their disposition, and I think that encourages people, particularly in New South Wales, knowing that as soon as those restrictions aren't necessary, they will be lifted, because that's what Gladys Berejiklian and her government have always sought to do during the course of this pandemic.
Are you surprised that New South Wales, or at least parts of it, haven't gone into lockdown?
No, I'm not, because that has always been, I think, their determination through this process. Where we go back to the situation earlier in the year, they didn't shut the whole city down. They focused on the northern beaches, and they've always had a very targeted approach to how they've addressed these things, a hotspot approach. And as you know, I've always been a big proponent of that hotspot approach. Now, there are hotspots in Sydney now, but the virus, we've got to remind ourselves, you know, the virus has not gone away, and I know it's incredibly frustrating that it hasn't gone away, but we're not alone in that. And, you know, we are still in this fight with this virus. But despite that fight, you know, our economy is stronger today than it was before the pandemic. There are more people in work today than there was before the pandemic. There are a few countries in the world that can say that, and there is not one person in the country right now who's in an ICU because of COVID-19. That is something most countries in the world also can't say.
But we're still in a position where we're seeing borders close and lockdowns across the country. So how much of this is on you and the slow vaccine rollout?
Well, the vaccine rollout will hit 7 million doses this week. We're at just 2/3 of people aged over 70 have had their first dose. Around half of those over 50 have had their first dose, and more than 1 in 4 over 16 have had their first dose. The ramp up with the supply will really kick in next month in July. There'll be some 600,000 doses of Pfizer that'll come in a week, and that'll ramp up as General Fruin, who heads up the operation for the vaccine, that will be hitting over 2 million when we get into October. The challenge we've had, of course, has been with AstraZeneca. I mean, the medical advice has restricted its availability to those over 60, and prior to that, over 50. Now, that was a big shock to the rollout, and they are events outside of the government's control. But thankfully, we're able to put in place significant supply arrangement, not just with AstraZeneca, but also with Pfizer and Moderna, and of course, there's the Novavax and the COVAX facilities as well. So we'll keep working towards that goal by the end of the year of offering that vaccine to everybody who would want one, and there'll be an escalating ramp up as we move through the second half of the year.
So Jackie Lambie says the government took the cheap option on vaccinations and it's come back to bite you.
Well, that's rubbish. I mean, it's $7 billion. That's not cheap in anybody's language.
Cheaper than Pfizer,
$7 billion. I'm sorry, $7 billion in actually creating a manufacturing capability here for AstraZeneca, and then the purchase of some 40 million doses of Pfizer, and then on top of that, the doses from Moderna and through the COVAX facility and Novavax. I mean, the Commonwealth has invested over $310 billion in supporting Australia through this pandemic in health and economic measures. That's more than twice what all the states and territories have done together combined and more. So Australia has spared no effort in protecting the lives and livelihoods of Australians. And had we not, if we had the same death rate as countries around the world, like Australia, 30,000 more Australians would have died. I'd say that we've acted to save lives and livelihoods.
Well, I mean, AstraZeneca is going to be phased out in October. That's the only one we can produce on home soil. You're now reliant on international supplies. It puts us in a very vulnerable position, doesn't it?
Well, we're no different to most countries around the world. I mean, those mRNA vaccines was a proprietary IP that was held in the United States, and it can be manufactured in Europe. It's not manufactured anywhere else. And so it's important that we secured those supplies. And I've got to say the Pfizer supply deliveries have been consistent with their contractual arrangements. So, you know, we're in the same boat as New Zealand. They don't have a manufacturing capability there either for those mRNA vaccines. We're all working to establish those. But let's not forget, when we were talking a year ago, mRNA vaccines, indeed a vaccine for COVID, was almost science fiction. A year on, they're being dispensed around the world, and Australia has millions of them going into the arms of Australians.
OK, in reality, it will be at least until the end of the year before the majority of Australians get their second vaccination, right? So
that was always the case, Karl.
But it does leave the majority of Australians in the meantime vulnerable to this variant. The rollout is that slow. Those who have their vaccinations will probably need a booster shot by the time it rolls around for a second shot for some Australians, the way it's going. If the public believes this rollout has been too slow, too mistake-ridden, will it cost you the next election?
That is the last thing on my mind, Karl. I'm just simply doing everything we can to save lives and livelihoods. And as I said, the record of where we are in this country, I mean, there are 14,000 cases in the UK yesterday. 14,000. They've got a vaccination rate of 81%. You know, more than 20 people died in the UK yesterday. That's not happening in Australia, and Australians understand that. And so we'll continue to ramp up the vaccination program. It had its challenges on the AstraZeneca vaccine because of the medical advice, and we've responded to that, and we've ramped up the vaccination program. So it's just important that we just get on with it, Karl. I'll leave the politics to others.
OK. Look, it's good to see while you've been away, the cat has been playing. Barnaby is back. He's kind of like a pebble in your R.M. William boot, isn't he, Prime Minister? I mean, how are you going to control him?
Oh, I describe him as a wind in the sails. A wind in the sails.
Do you like him, and can you work with him?
Of course, we have before. I was Treasurer when he was Deputy Prime Minister before. Barney and I have sat around cabinet tables for years, and we're both passionate about what we want to achieve for this country, and the government's program, which has been, you know, making an enormous difference. I mean, just think about where we are. Unemployment rate in Australia is 5.1%. I mean, while the pandemic has wreaked havoc around the world, when I sat around the G7 table, only South Korea and Australia could say their economies were bigger now than they were before the pandemic. And the rest of the world is in astonishment that while they've had fatality rates like they've experienced overseas, Australia has been able to come through this pandemic to this state with losses that are dwarfed by those overseas. So Australians have done well is really my point, Karl and Ali. Australia and Sydney-siders are going to be doing well over the course of this next week. And we will get through it like we have every time. But we can't kid ourselves. This pandemic, this virus, COVID-19 is out to cause damage, and we're going to fight it as we always have with everything we've got.
Having sailed a few times, wind when you're on board a vessel can be a funny thing. It can be helpful. It can also be very destructive.
This is going to get us where we need to go as a country. And,
where are you taking us?
Well done on the sailing analogies.
You'll see.
Good on you, PM. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks
Appreciate
a lot, Karl. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you. See what happens when he goes into quarantine. There's leadership spills, outbreaks.
I mean,
everything falls apart.
it's the end of the world.
Feels like it.